a short reading from my book, about a 10-minute reading from my book, just right from the introduction, so you don't need to know anything going in. And then I will introduce Dennis, and we will chat for a little bit about some of his really remarkable research about the connections between Shakespeare and Thomas North, the North in North by Shakespeare. And then we'll leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end for questions. So definitely put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and really look forward to having a conversation at the end of the evening. So let's see here, if I can start this screen share here. Okay. Great. So I'm going to give a little reading from my book, and I've got some visual aids as well. So it'll be sort of both the reading and some pretty pictures to look at. It was the greatest party of Elizabeth's reign. 19 days of gut-busting feasts, minstrel performances, bear baiting, Italian acrobats, and jaw-dropping fireworks. All of it was designed for a single purpose: to woo a queen. When Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, planned the festivities at his estate of Kenilworth Castle in July 1575, he was getting desperate. After 15 years of vying for Queen Elizabeth's hand, he was no closer to the promise of marriage than when he'd begun. The Kenilworth Festival was his last-ditch attempt at winning the Queen's affections, and Leicester spared no expense to impress her, spending lavishly on new gardens, gifts, and performances. As the party raged, nobles and gentry from across the realm, as well as commoners from the countryside, guzzled 40 barrels of beer and 16 barrels of wine a day as they pursued wanton encounters in the surrounding woods and fields. Leicester kept his eyes on the Queen, anxiously watching for signs that she was enjoying the elaborate masques and other entertainments he had dreamed up in her honor. On several nights, Leicester unleashed fireworks displays created by an Italian pyrotechnician over a man-made lake that lapped against the western walls of the castle. The spectacles lasted for hours, including dazzling dragons, fighting dogs and cats, and rockets that seemed to shoot out of the water itself. A contemporary observer described them as a blaze of burning darts flying to and fro, gleams of stars coruscant, streams and hail of fiery sparks, of such intensity that the heavens thundered, the water surged, the earth shook. Another night, the Earl staged a giant water pageant as Elizabeth was making her way across a long bridge over the lake. An actor dressed as the sea god Triton rode across the water to her on a mechanical mermaid. Sounding a trumpet in the shape of a whelk, he commanded the seas to still, shouting, "You waters wild, suppress your waves and keep you calm and plain." After his speech, another actor dressed as the fabled Greek musician Arion serenaded her from atop a 24-foot-long mechanical dolphin. Music emanated eerily from the dolphin's belly, where an ensemble of musicians had been secreted inside. There's no record of how the Queen received the performance, whether she stood stony-faced or smiled and clapped with joy, or felt a rise of love in her heart for the man who had gone to such extravagant lengths to please her. But the moment has been immortalized after a fashion in William Shakespeare's most beloved play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. In one scene, Oberon, king of the fairies, reminisces to his underling Puck while in a jealous fit over the fairy queen Titania, using words that might have equally applied to the Kenilworth water pageant. "Thou rememberest, since once I sat upon a promontory and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music," he says to Puck. "That very time I saw, but thou couldst not, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid, all armed. A certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow, as it should pierce 100,000 hearts." For more than a century, those lines have been read as an allusion to Leicester, who shot a love arrow at his own vestal, England's famous Virgin Queen Elizabeth, at a pageant complete with dolphin, mermaid, and fireworks, just as in Oberon's vision. It's less clear how Shakespeare, then a boy 11 years old, could have witnessed the spectacle, or why he would have included it in a play written around 1595, some 20 years after the event. In his book, Will and the World, Harvard professor Stephen Greenblatt allows that it is certainly conceivable that Shakespeare's father may have taken him from their home in Stratford upon Avon, 14 miles away, to see the display. If so, then perhaps Shakespeare stood with his father upon a promontory overlooking the lake to catch a glimpse of the entertainment, and perhaps the sight made such an impression on him that he remembered it for the next 2 decades, and perhaps he found a moment to work it into a play performed before the Queen to remind her of her youthful wooing by her favorite courtier. Those are a lot of perhapses. It's not the only explanation, however, for how the Kenilworth water pageant could have inspired Shakespeare's comedy. The playwright could have heard a report from someone who attended, or read about it in a letter circulated after the event. Or there was another possibility. Perhaps another person wrote those lines, someone who attended the event as a guest and witnessed the pageant firsthand. I first heard the name Thomas North in October 2015. I had been invited to Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania to give a lecture about a book I'd written about a thief of rare maps. The weather was unseasonably warm and the foliage was in full array, with a spectacular red maple lighting up the picture window of the library lecture hall. Afterwards, the lecture's sponsors, English professor Emerita June Schluter and her husband Paul, a literature scholar, took me to a dinner reception. Over a pasta buffet, they introduced me to a scholar named Dennis McCarthy, a confident 53-year-old who looked a decade younger than his age. McCarthy had attended my lecture with his adult daughter, Nicole Golovsky, and only later did I learn that the two positioned themselves around the last remaining seats so I would sit next to one of them. McCarthy immediately pulled me into conversation, asking me about my book and telling me about his own research. He had written a book called Here Be Dragons on the subject of biogeography, and before long we were spiritedly discussing maps and geography together. As the reception wound down, he invited me to continue talking over drinks with his daughter and her fiance. It took me about a half a second to decide. I was alone on a Thursday night in a small college town, and the thought of going back to my B&B was infinitely less appealing. I figured I could have a few drinks and continue an enjoyable conversation. I had no idea how this chance meeting would start me down a path to trace a literary mystery that I'd follow along with McCarthy for the next 5 years. We headed to the College Hill Tavern, a bar with old sports memorabilia framed on the walls, go Leopards, and students and locals drinking liquor from plastic cups. We sat at a chipped wooden high top, straining to hear each other over the impromptu karaoke of nearby patrons. I don't know whose idea it was to order martinis, but I was a bit foggy by the time McCarthy finally leaned across the table and told me he had a story for me. You know how Shakespeare used other sources to write his plays? McCarthy asked me over the din of amateur Bon Jovi. Sure, I replied, trying to remember anything about Shakespeare's sources from my first year college class. Well, I found a source no one ever knew about before, he said. This unknown manuscript, he continued, was a treatise by a 16th century courtier named George North. The work, he claimed, influenced some of Shakespeare's greatest plays, including Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear. But Shakespeare had never even read the manuscript, McCarthy continued, as I struggled to follow his argument through a haze of classic rock and booze. Instead, George's relative, Sir Thomas North, had used it to write his own plays. Oh, he is one of those, I thought to myself, a conspiracy theorist who thought Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. But McCarthy hurriedly added that, in fact, he believed the Bard of Avon wrote every play attributed to him during his lifetime. He also believed, however, that Shakespeare had used these earlier plays by Thomas North for his ideas, his language, and even some of his most famous soliloquies. There was something about a murder involving North's sister, and an affair Queen Elizabeth may or may not have had with North's patron, the Earl of Leicester, and a tale of familial exile uncannily like Prospero's story in The Tempest. I didn't believe any of it. Where are North's plays now, I asked. Lost, McCarthy said, but so were most manuscripts written in the Elizabethan era. Why hadn't anyone discovered this before? Because no one had the right tools to do so, he said, arguing excitedly that his computer-assisted techniques had the potential to finally solve the mystery of how and why Shakespeare's plays were written. I vaguely knew about the conspiracy theories that Shakespeare was a fraud and the plays were really written by the Earl of Oxford or someone else. But this was something different. McCarthy's theory was more akin to saying Shakespeare plagiarized or collaborated with another writer. The theory seemed outlandish, but I liked McCarthy and was somewhat amused by the lengths to which he'd gone to pitch me. I promised to look at whatever he sent me. So that's how I start my book, and describe the meeting I had with Dennis the first time about 6 years ago. And as I said in the introduction, it sort of started me down this adventure that would last for 5 years and counting. It's sort of still going on. But Dennis published his book on the George North manuscript 3 years later in 2018. And I ended up writing an article about it for the New York Times. And it was incredibly well received. It actually made the front page of the Times, and scholars and lay people alike were very intrigued by the fact that there was this undiscovered manuscript that no one had ever known before that inspired 11 of Shakespeare's plays. One scholar, the director of the Shakespeare Folger Library, called it the most significant find in a generation or maybe several generations. And again, it was something that was really well received and acclaimed as this amazing discovery. But as I mentioned, this was only a part of Dennis's theory, that he actually didn't believe that Shakespeare used this manuscript. He believed that it was used by this other writer, Sir Thomas North, and who was a cousin of George North. And he used this manuscript along with a number of other sources and wrote these earlier source plays that were later adapted by Shakespeare into his plays. And through his research, much of it using computer software, Dennis really spun this amazing story that, as he started telling me more and more about it, I really felt like there was something there. It really answered a lot of the mysteries behind Shakespeare and some of the questions we've never been able to answer about Shakespeare's plays. And so I invited him to work with me, and we ended up traveling all over England and France and Italy together, and having long conversations about his findings, and that resulted in this book, North by Shakespeare, which we're going to talk a little bit more about tonight. So I'm going to stop my slideshow for a moment here and bring Dennis into the conversation. As Erin had said, Dennis is the author of 2 books and counting on the Thomas North theory, as well as several peer-reviewed articles about his findings. And Dennis, let me just start by asking you, you sort of heard my side of the story in terms of our meeting. Tell us your side of the story. What was it that you were trying to get out of that booze-filled encounter that we had at that Eastern Pennsylvania bar?
Well, I was hoping most for a drinking friend, and
that you got.
You are fabulous at that. But also, I believe June Schluter, whose lecture, it was her lecture that you were speaking at, and my co-author for the book was setting this up. She's she's a provost at Lafayette, former provost. She's a great scholar, and has been with me for the last 10 years. I think she got you there just in the outside chance we met, hit it off, and I tried to make sure that occurred, just hoping possibly there was an article that, because I knew you were a great investigative journalist, besides being a great nonfiction book writer.
Well, tell me, now that we've obviously got a lot more than an article here.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Why are there so many questions about Shakespeare and the way he wrote his plays? I mean, for the greatest author in the English language, for somebody who has influenced so much of our culture and literature, why is this the enduring question about, how Shakespeare wrote his plays, or if Shakespeare wrote his plays?
Well, it became really big again in the 19th century when this scholar in 1837, writing on the life of Shakespeare, discovered, which had been known for centuries, and people keep saying this, that Shakespeare used source plays. These source plays exist. No one denies that. Scholars readily admit this. And they know this because there's all these references to these old plays, Shakespeare plays, like a Romeo and Juliet in 1562, before Shakespeare was born, that are way too early for Shakespeare to have written them. And so the scholar in 1837, he's writing about the life of Shakespeare, said that almost all his plays were based on older plays. And this infuriated one person named Joseph Hard, who said, well, who is the genius behind the canon? And then everything exploded from there. That's in the 19th century. Delia Bacon, who suggested Francis Bacon wrote them. And so what happened then when they start looking at Shakespeare's life, they realize there's really nothing there that could have helped him write, let's say, all the plays, the 8 to 10 plays on Italy, and all of the information about Italy. There's all sorts of legal. There's a legal dictionary just for all the legal terms and all the legal references in the Shakespeare canon, all the references on war. And Shakespeare had none of those experiences. He went from Stratford, rural, to being a great playwright, theater producer, and working all the time. He was in the plays, producing the plays, running the theater. And they're wondering how could he have gotten these experiences and learned about all these facts in order to put them in the plays.
And so, that's what I like about your theory. Once I started reading about it, once I started understanding, is that, you're not saying that there's some conspiracy theory that somebody else wrote his plays and Shakespeare just put his name on it, but you were saying that this person, Thomas North, wrote these earlier plays that then Shakespeare was taking and adapting and making into his own. So talk a little bit about who Thomas North
is. Agree that Shakespeare used old plays. So I'm just putting a name on it.
So tell us a little bit more about this name. Who is Thomas North, and what convinced you that he was the source of not just 1 or 2 or 3 of these plays, but all of the plays that we know of as Shakespeare?
Well, so Thomas North is this great book, North by Shakespeare shows, led a very thrilling life, and he happened to be just everywhere. In all the palaces of France and Italy, meeting dukes and kings and queens. And he leads you can almost break his life in half till about 40 years old, where he leads a very fabulous and wealthy life. And then the last half of his life, he's in 3 wars abroad and suffers poverty at home. And this is especially, and he became a playwright for the Earl of Leicester, which was his patron. He dedicated one of his translations to the Earl of Leicester, and Leicester having plays performed from 1559 up until his death, 1588. But we don't know anything about his repertory. We don't know exactly what the plays were. We've got some clue to a few of them, and we don't know his playwrights. But now we know Thomas North is one of them. And those are the plays that Shakespeare ended up adapting. And that explains everything. Now there's no more mysteries.
And we know that there's some connection between Thomas North and Shakespeare, right? Because scholars have known that Shakespeare used Thomas North's writings for some of his plays. But talk about that, about kind of what scholars know about Thomas North and how that differs from what you have discovered.
Right. If you look, if you research Thomas North at all, one of the first things you'll find, this is what everybody has, is that he wrote the translation to Plutarch's Lives, publishing in 1579, 1580. And it's the source, and I mean extreme source, for the Roman plays, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Julius Caesar. And these are straight adaptations, unlike any other source that Shakespeare used, in which there's legends that, Hamlet's a legend, and Much Ado About Nothing was a legend, in which you're inventing all these characters and all these speeches. That's not what is occurring with the Roman plays, which is as close to Thomas North, which is closer to Thomas North's chapters in Plutarch's Lives than, say, Lord of the Rings, the movie, is to J.R.R. Tolkien's book, or Silence of the Lambs, the movie, is to Silence of the Lambs novel. It's closer, that much of an adaptation. So the big speeches and the big descriptions, even in those plays, are from North's Plutarch's Lives. This shocked a lot of scholars in the 19th century when discovering it. And my point is, Shakespeare wasn't borrowing from Plutarch's Lives. North had written plays on them, and he was later adapting the plays. And you find out that's true of all the plays in the canon, essentially.
And so what turned you on to this in the first place? I mean, your contention is that these plays are lost, that Thomas North wrote these plays for the Earl of Leicester. These manuscripts have since been lost. Talk a little bit about the clues that kind of led you here, because you're not a trained Shakespeare scholar. You're not somebody who, has a PhD in Shakespeare studies. You were working on science and this field of biogeography, and how did you sort of get involved in Shakespeare, and how did you hone in on Thomas North as the source of these plays?
Well, biogeography, which is the intersection of evolution and plate tectonics, geophysics, shows how Earth and life evolved together. And I wanted to give an example of how ideas also spread across the Earth, whether it's cultural units, whether it's technologies or religions or languages. They evolve, they spread across the Earth, and they do the same way as species do, which is what the subject of biogeography is, to show the movement of the species and their changes as they move in different regions. So I wanted to give an idea of one of the most important celebrated ideas ever, Hamlet. Where did that come from? Where was the evolution of these ideas, and how do they all end up in London? So the story is a Danish legend, and it comes down into France, and it moves into London in the 1570s. And then there's stuff from Seneca, there's stuff from Plutarch, there's all sorts of other philosophy, humanist literature that all ended up in London at different times and in the mind of someone. But if you search the history of Hamlet, you discover, and this again is conventional, no scholar denies this, there's an early reference to an Hamlet by Thomas Nash in 1589, perhaps before Shakespeare even started writing his first play. And it refers to an English Seneca having written a Hamlet. And I realized that, okay, so if I'm going to actually tell this story of the history of Hamlet, it's not Shakespeare who originally put the Seneca and the legend together, and the Danish legend together. It's this other guy. And I thought I could figure it out with English Seneca. And the only reason is because there's early English books online now. There's databases of everything Nash wrote. There's databases of everything Satyrus wrote of the era. And I thought, well, I can break down these paragraphs. I'm sure he wanted people to know who English Seneca was. He wasn't trying to create a mystery that's unsolvable for hundreds of years. And I knew that we just had now all the information of who he's quoting, who he's punning on. And it turns out to be Thomas North was English Seneca. And he was clearly making that clear. And you start studying more and more, you realize the satirists of the era are crediting North for all the plays and saying that Shakespeare did adapt them.
Yeah, and I love how you sort of puzzled that out from all these clues in these various satires when they would talk about like the North Wind, or make these kind of puns and allusions to his name or to his
the play, let's leave this northern clime. They would do it again, or they would quote his Plutarch's line. They would do it again and again, and it's obvious.
Yeah. And then one of the tools that you started using at a certain point was this plagiarism software. So explain to folks what this is. What's this computer software that you used, and why is this a legitimate tool that you could use as a scholar in order to find connections between Thomas North and William Shakespeare and his plays?
Yeah, so I got the idea from Sir Brian Vickers, who's a well-known Shakespeare scholar, who started using it in authorship studies to find all the parallel lines and passages. And when people write, and this is a subject of forensic linguistics, the Unabomber was caught due to passages that he had written, that they had known that Kaczynski had written, and the manifesto that he had sent to the Washington Post. And when a person writes, if they're writing on the same subject, they'll often echo their prior writings. They'll use weird phrases, weird lines that come from it that no one else uses. And so that's why I use plagiarism software to find these lines. And when I ran it through the works of Thomas North and the works of Shakespeare, it just exploded. And it's just hundreds and hundreds of passages that clearly North wrote first in his translations, and that inspired certain scenes, characters, images, and speeches in the plays.
Yeah, and this is something I wanted to show, because I think you really have to kind of see it visually. But like, for example, this is Antony and Cleopatra in North's Plutarch's Lives, which again, everyone knows is sort of a source for Shakespeare's play. But when you really look at them side by side, and everything in red there is kind of lit up as common between these two passages, you see it's just sort of a point by point, rephrasing of North's work. And what I found captivating about what Dennis has found, and this is from his website here. I know you can't really see this, but I just wanted to show you sort of the scope of it. Tell folks what we're looking at here when we scroll through your website, all these different examples that you found.
Right. This is passage after passage in which it is indisputable that the passage on the left written by North, or the lines written on the left, necessarily are the origin of the lines written on the right in the Shakespeare play. So what was happening, obviously, is that Thomas North, when he was writing his translations, when he would start writing the plays, he would know these humanist lessons that he had written about earlier, and he would just write them in the speeches. And sometimes, as he's writing on the same subject, he'll borrow the exact same lines and use the exact same language. And when you use plagiarism software, you can find it. These are hundreds of passages from one author, Thomas North, that now appear in the Shakespeare canon. And there's nothing like this in the history of literature. I've even studied examples of plagiarism, of the most significant examples of plagiarism in history. No one comes close to borrowing from an earlier writer than Shakespeare does from Thomas North. And all this is newly discovered. All this is now just coming out this year. And people are still trying to adjust to it. And no, this is not like, oh, well, Shakespeare used sources, or people, everything's derivative. No, this is unique in the history of literature. There is no body of work that is based more on an earlier body of work than Shakespeare's in Norse. It is unique in the history of literature.
And so, I think one of the questions that I get, one of the questions I had for you early on is, why isn't this just an example of sort of, Shakespeare just using the same phrase? Maybe these were just phrases in common use in Elizabethan times, and everyone was kind of using these things. And so I wanted to bring up this example, which I know is one of the most compelling examples of borrowing. So you can kind of walk us through it and sort of answer that question of why this isn't just kind of common usage of words. Why do you think that, yes, Thomas North actually wrote a play that Shakespeare was borrowing from?
What's important is that the context in each case, they're both talking about the same peculiar and pointed subject. In this case, Thomas North in his Nepo's Lives writes about grief, and particularly the griefs of the inward soul, and how to resolve them, how to overcome them, the Stoic counseling that you need to overcome them. That's to realize it's a loss of perspective, as if seeing things through water. And he continues on in that passage and talks about those who would give up hope and dissolve the bands of this life, using that line in particular. This is indisputably the origin of the same exchange in Richard II between Bushy and the Queen, in which she talks about her grief of the inward soul. And he gives her the Stoic counseling that is in Nepo's Lives, which is to say that it's as if it's a loss of perspective, as if seeing things through water, looking with a false eye, seeing things through water. And she again contrasts hope with death, which is and would dissolve the bands of life, referring to death that would dissolve the bands of life. That line occurs, there's one other place that it occurs in English history, which is in a little known prayer. And then there's another edition of that prayer. But other than that, and that's not talking about grief, this is the only place you will ever find that line. But it's not like these are common phrases. These are unique or nearly unique in the history of English literature. And they're saying it in the exact same subject. What is particularly important about this passage, there's hundreds of passages from which you find in the canon from North. But this passage is peculiar because Thomas North wouldn't publish Nepo's Lives until 1602, which is 5 years after Richard II is published. And so whoever wrote this had to have access to Thomas North's personal passages.
Before he published it.
He had to have personal translations, yeah.
And speaking about unpublished writings, you also found another unpublished writing by Sir Thomas North. Tell folks what this journal is that you found and what it represents in terms of your thinking about the plays.
My co-author and partner, June Schluter, her husband found notice of this journal, which it was late at night when I was informed of this, and I stayed up all night trying to track it down. And I found different, there's some of its entries were published in an 18th century work. but this was written by Thomas North on a trip to Italy in 1555, and some of its entries were clearly used for both Henry VIII and Winter's Tale. And in fact, it helps explain Winter's Tale in a new way.
Yeah, and this was one of the things that I found really amazing, that because I had the question for you, well, why wasn't Shakespeare just sort of obsessed with Thomas North's writings? Why did why do we have to believe that Thomas North wrote other plays? And it was examples like this that were really really compelling in that regard. So talk about the ending of Winter's Tale and how it relates to Thomas North's journal.
So the ending of Winter's Tale has two spectacular scenes. One is this lifelike statue of this woman in a chapel of Hermione, and it's painted. It's a painted statue, comes to life again, and he notes that the statue, and this has confused scholars for centuries, was created by that rare master Giulio Romano. Now, there's other seeming allusions to Mantua in the work. So now how Shakespeare would know about Giulio Romano? For many years, they thought it was a mistake because they didn't think Giulio Romano ever created statues. But Thomas North visited Mantua, did get to see the artworks of Giulio Romano, and he specifically went to Santa Maria del Grazi, the church, which is decorated. It's got an entire tomb decorated and created by Giulio Romano, and he talks about the painted lifelike statues, which are the most wonderful works that he has seen in it. So while scholars have been trying to figure out, and people have said, well, he must have taken a trip to Mantua, and lots of people bring up this church when talking about Winter's Tale, we can't just place North in Italy and in the right cities. We can place him in the right rooms talking about the right objects. That's the last scene. And in the earlier scene, there's a pastoral scene in which there's a meeting of the lesser gods, in which Perdita comes dressed as the goddess Flora, and there's a dance of satyrs, and Florizel is dressed as Apollo, as a humble swain, and there's all these mentions of these gods, and that's where Thomas North saw the murals of Giulio Romano, which also has this very scene. So Act 4 and Act 5 of Winter's Tale are the descriptions of what he saw in Mantua, and that we can prove he's there in the journal.
Yeah, and we don't have time to go through some of the other examples, but I know you have other examples from Thomas North's life as well, about the murder that his sister committed, and how that might have inspired Macbeth, and how his relationship with his brother might have inspired The Tempest. But because Wilmington will be seeing the Much Ado About Nothing, which will be performed in next week on the Green in Wilmington, I thought we could talk a little bit more about the relationship between Elizabeth and Leicester, because that sort of figures into your understanding of that play. But for starters, just tell me a little bit about sort of why Leicester becomes an important figure, and I opened my book talking about Leicester and the Kenilworth Festival. Why did the Kenilworth Festival influence Midsummer Night's Dream? Why do you sort of see traces of Leicester and Elizabeth's relationship in the plays as well?
Well, Leicester was Thomas North's brother, Lord North, Roger North's essentially best friend. Lord North was one of the few people to attend Leicester's secret wedding in 1578. And Thomas North wrote for Leicester. He wrote Moral Philosophy of Donny, dedicated to him, and he was writing plays for Leicester. When you look at Roger North's household accounts, you find lots of payments to Thomas North and Leicester's men at the same time, including one which I believe is a payment for a play at court in 1580. And this is why all the plays are advocating Leicester's point of view, and particularly taking on all of Elizabeth's suitors. Leicester doesn't want Queen Elizabeth to marry anyone. He wants to be king, and she keeps on getting suitors. Foreign suitors are offered to her, starting back in 1561 when the King of the Goths was offered, and I wrote an article with June Schluter how the play Titus Andronicus is based on that, which is what happens to a country when you marry a Goth. It's catastrophic. It's the same thing. Don John the Bastard of Austria, who was very challenging and confrontational to England in the 1570s, was also they were also thinking of Elizabeth being offered marriage to John just to get rid of an enemy and create this powerful alliance, but he wouldn't have it. But he's the villain of Much Ado About Nothing. And this is really, when they say Don John, he's called the bastard in Much Ado About Nothing. It's set in Messina, Sicily. This is the statue of Don John in Messina. So no one denies that this is, and they're coming home after this great sea battle, and which is the Battle of Otranto. So which Don John won. So the play is literally set in 1571 in Messina, and the characters Don John. The Kenilworth festivities again was an effort to woo Queen Elizabeth. You then have the Duke of Alençon in other plays in which he's attacked, particularly in Henry VI Part 1. He's also referred to in Love's Labour's Lost. And again, these are all negative portrayals of him, and that's because Duke of Alençon is a suitor, and they're trying, and Leicester is just putting on plays attacking his suitors, and Thomas North is writing them. And that's why it's so bizarre, and scholars don't understand why are all these dated references. Don John the Bastard dies in 1578. Shakespeare's at that point is 14 years old. Duke of Alençon dies in 1584. Shakespeare's still in Stratford. He hasn't written a play yet. All these characters, he's writing in the 1590s, decades later. Why is he referring to all of these historical characters? When you know Thomas North's life, it all comes together.
And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the research that you've done is it's not just kind of finding these allusions, it's not just finding Thomas North's language in the plays, but you're also actually finding evidence of some of these earlier source plays. And I think Much Ado About Nothing is a really good example of this. Not only do you find these references to Don John of Austria from the, who was courting Elizabeth in the 1570s, but you've also found evidence of this earlier source play that may be used for Much Ado About Nothing. So talk about this, the matter of Phoenicia and how that relates to Much Ado About Nothing.
So the story, the actual story in Bandello, which is the source legend for Much Ado About Nothing, the name of the main heroine, named Hero in Shakespeare's play, is Phoenicia. And there is a German version of an English play in which the title is also Phoenicia. And it even has, in this German version, which admits to being on an English play, it even has the Benedict and Beatrice subplot. So they have an idea that the name of the English play was Phoenicia. It's based on the source story. And there's a Lesterman's play where they were looking for evidence that this earlier Phoenicia existed other than the German version. And there's a Lesterman's play called Phoenicia, which they believe was Phoenicia, and just a misprint of that. This was performed at court in 1574. All of that makes sense if Thomas North is writing for Leicester at that time, and why they would attack Don John at that time.
And so you have this plot of Much Ado About Nothing, as you said, which is sort of based on this Italian work, and it involves this sort of mistaken identities and this villain, Don John, who's sort of trying to turn Hero and who's Claudio against Hero, his betrothed, and the Beatrix and Benedict, these kind of warring merry lovers, and the subplot, and all of that is in this German play called Phoenicia. And then at the same time, there's this 1574 English play called Phoenicia, performed by Leicester's Men. So I just love all that detective work, just to put all those pieces together and sort of see that everything kind of kind of lines up in this and sort of gets tied up with this neat little bow that, you know, points to Thomas North writing this earlier play. So
And Norse
it's
passages
hard
are in the play.
hard to
And
be skeptical.
right, right. And it's Norse writing, it's Norse passages in the plays, you know, and we can do this play by play by play. It's Norse, you see what he's just written, you find Norse passages. This is particularly influenced by Moral Philosophy of Donnie, which he translated in 1570.
And so I just wanted to just sum up here a little bit, because I do want to leave some time for questions, but I also just wanted to show a little bit about kind of our process working together and you know, the fun that we had. You know, when I first proposed to Dennis that we write this book together, or that I would write the book based on his research, that you know, I didn't want to just have it be just two guys sitting across the table talking about Shakespeare for 300 pages. I thought that readers would get tired of that very, very quickly. And it just so happened that Dennis's daughter is a documentary filmmaker who's worked with Oprah on the Disney Channel, and she's been working on a documentary about her dad and about his theories. And so we kind of teamed up, and we traveled across England and France and Italy together. And his daughter Nicole would film for her documentary, and I would interview Dennis, and I would, you know, we'd go into archives together. We'd go into many of these locations that figure into Thomas North's story and Shakespeare's plays. For example, here we are at Kenilworth, which is this, you know, beautiful ruin today. There's Kirtling Hall, which is Thomas North's childhood home. We actually weren't allowed in, but we sort of, you know, were able to kind of film outside on public land, I assure you. Here we are at the Palazzo Te and that church in Mantua that we talked about before that may have inspired The Winter's Tale. We went to Venice and we looked at some of the traces of The Merchant of Venice and Othello, and sort of one by one, you know, it was almost like, I think of it as almost like Scrooge and Marley's ghosts, sort of, you know, following, you know, the ghosts of Christmas past, and sort of, you know, seeing these ghosts of history that were sort of walking before us, and Thomas North and his travels, and the relationship of the Queen and Leicester and all of these historical figures, and then trying to fit them into the play. There's Nicole, Dennis's daughter, on the far right there. And as Dennis mentioned, I also just wanted to give a shout out to June Schluter, who's also a character in my book, and Dennis's co-writer and collaborator, and they've sort of formed this odd couple relationship. She's a very distinguished Shakespearean scholar who Dennis was able to convince of his theories, and has actually you know, written these 2 books with him, and these various articles, and really you know, given a lot of legitimacy to Dennis, even though he's sort of fought this uphill battle against scholars who have not been so kind to some of his ideas. But I just wanted to finish, Dennis, by asking you, you know, kind of the million-dollar question, which is, why does any of this matter? I mean, why do we care whether Shakespeare's plays were written by Sir Francis Bacon or adapted from source plays by Sir Thomas North? What does knowing about North and knowing about his potential involvement in these plays, how does it influence how we read and understand these works of literature?
Well, it really helps you understand the plays in a completely new and more profound way. It's a little like, and I like to use the analogy of the crucible, and discovering later, after everyone celebrates the play, that it's actually based on the communist, the trial of communists and the blacklisting of communists by Joseph McCarthy in the early 1550s, or Animal Farm, and you think it's just this wonderful fairy tale and everybody likes it, and then you realize, oh, it's later, it's actually based on the Russian Revolution, and the characters line up, and with Napoleon being the pig being Stalin. You find out that the plays are, in many cases, always deriving from Norse life, but are allegories for the events of Thomas North's life. They're very topical. Winter's Tale, which not only comes from his trip, but it's based on the life of Queen Mary. And you see the history of all of the plays going through the Tudor history from the 1550s into the early 1590s. It makes things so much more exciting and thrilling, because it's not just Norse words that are in the plays, but his entire life.
Yeah. And some of his personal relationships as well, with his sister,
personal
and his
relationships,
brother,
his
and
daughter,
various other people.
Rosalind, yeah, is his daughter, the number one, the largest, most beloved role in the canon, perhaps the largest female role in the canon. And Rosalind is his daughter. And that's it. Percy, Spencer Scholar discovered this in 1905. And it just makes it so much richer. The plays are better than you think. They're more intellectually impressive than we ever realized.
All right. Well, we have a little bit of time left here. And so I'm really curious if people have questions or comments or things that we'd like to have a discussion of. Dennis and I can talk about this for hours. So we'd really love to hear your thoughts.
You have to stop us.
Excellent. It looks like we do have a question in the chat. And audience members, please do put any questions you have in the chat. The question is, I recall reading that Francis Bacon was speculated to write under the name Shakespeare. I think you've kind of gone into why you think that North is a more credible source, but what do you think of the Francis Bacon kind of theory?
Well, I understand why each of the people have been candidates, whether it's Oxford or Derby. You're looking for a certain type of mind, you're looking for a certain type of experiences, but all that is very general and vague. If you look at Francis Bacon has so much writing that you can check to see if there's anything, any Shakespearean lines that you should be able to find. They find a few words or so. And this is actually true of nearly every candidate. And their lives don't really match up. It's just they're working on a few minor verbal echoes and a few minor coincidences in some subplots of the plays where we've got it play by play, plot and subplot directly from his life and North's passages, speeches straight from North, play after play for 50 freaking years. It's not even close.
Sure. I have a question. So, Dennis, you made this initial discovery, or part of your discovery was done with plagiarism software. So I'm kind of curious how you think we should think of Shakespeare now. Was Shakespeare a plagiarist? Is he a punch-up writer for North? Is he, did he bring enough of his own work to it to have that kind of authorship? What do you think?
I think adapter is a great term, and that's exactly what he was doing. He was adapting older plays for the stage. He was a great producer. Tom Ditto, I believe, comes up with the Walt Disney analogy, in which he's also organizing and sort of became the brand name for all the plays that he's performing. So it's not just that Thomas North's old plays that he adapted got attributed to Shakespeare. He also worked on other plays like Yorkshire Tragedy, London Prodigal. These were also published under Shakespeare's name, with Shakespeare's name on the title page as well. And they don't think they are his, and that's simply because they don't read like North's works.
And one of the things,
sorry, Michael.
I was just going to say, I did a lot of my own research. Originally, I was sort of skeptical about this idea that Shakespeare could be adapting these other plays. But the more I read about it, the more I discovered that in Elizabethan times, this kind of thing was done all the time, that there was really no concept of plagiarism. The word plagiarism didn't even exist until 1598. And everyone was kind of borrowing from other people, rewriting other people, putting their name on it. So it's a much more kind of elegant theory than thinking it was some sort of conspiracy that Shakespeare was putting his name on the work of another writer. He was simply taking these other works and adapting them, and then he could legitimately put his name on it because that was sort of the convention of the time.
Excellent. Yes, that's what I was going to ask, is if you think that it was kind of just known and accepted that these were borrowed works at the time, just how we know that Disney movies are borrowed plots from fairy tales and things like that. If people would have batted an eye at the information that he was borrowing from other sources.
Yeah, I think it was known at the time, and then I think that it was sort of forgotten for a long time because Shakespeare, sort of for political reasons in England, became kind of held up as this like brilliant, soul of the age, playwright that was, the pinnacle of playwriting almost godlike. And it's only more recently in the last, 20 or 30 years that people have started going back and actually, looking at this idea of collaboration. And there's many mainstream scholars who believe that Shakespeare collaborated with Marlowe and Thomas Kidd and Thomas Nash and these other writers. And so it's, you don't have to be some, wild-eyed conspiracy theory to believe that, Shakespeare didn't write these things by himself. Oh, I see we got a lot of questions now.
Yes, yeah.
Good. I love it. I love it.
The chat is filling up. In cases where Shakespeare's writing is nearly word for word, why do you think he would have done that? Kind of word for word usage. Would it have sullied his credibility as a great writer?
Well, it does show he's not as original as most people today believe, but at the time he was known to be an adapter of the stage. It's a little like being furious at Peter Jackson because a number of passages from Lord of the Rings is in his movie, or same thing with Silence of the Lambs is another example I use. So, and there were people complaining about it. Green's Grocer of the Wit, when they call him an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. Crow is the Horatian symbol for plagiarist. And he's right, and it's Robert Greene, allegedly, who wrote this. And there was a work named Locrine that Shakespeare ended up getting credit for. That was originally written likely by Robert Greene. And the other person he was talking about is Thomas North. Who's getting credit. Another Ben Jonson says he would buy the reversion, which is like the copyright at the time. They didn't really have it, but he would buy the reversion of old plays and marks not whose 'twas first. And after times may think it to be his. That means the future may think he's the author because he's buying these old plays and adapting them. It's said over and over again in the late 1600s. Ravenscroft says, I've heard that Titus Andronicus is not Shakespeare's. It was brought by some gentleman to be acted. So the people are saying what all the other evidence demands and what scholars now accept. Shakespeare used old plays.
Let's see. There are others who have been identified as sources for Shakespeare's work, including the historian Holinshed. Do you think that North is one of many sources? That's a question from Francis in the chat.
I'm sorry, what's it? No, North is not like yeah, there are many, yes, there are many sources. Hi, Francis. There are many, there's dozens of sources that are used. This is true of most writers and most today's, particularly ones that try to get some historical realism into their plays. There's dozens of sources, but no one, with Holinshed, for example, uses for the English history. So if you look at the English histories, you're going to find sometimes he'll take, if he needs he wants the exact quote from someone at a time, he'll use that. But there's nothing like what he's taking from Shakespeare. You don't find anything from Holinshed in the tragedies or the comedies. You don't find what he's doing with Thomas North. And the only reason is because Thomas North wrote the plays and he's constantly recycling his passages. So you've got hundreds of passages in every play in the canon from all of Thomas North's works, and essentially all of Shakespeare's plays. And you don't see like that. Not only did Shakespeare not borrow from anyone else like this, no one in history has ever borrowed like this from another writer. Now, it may not be 1/10 as much. There may not, the greatest plagiarists in history, if you look at famous historical examples, Tristram Shandy and Robert Burton, isn't 1/10 as much of the borrowings as Shakespeare is from North. And it's just a matter, it's just a matter of people emotionally acclimating to this fact. But you go to sirthomasnorth.com, just go down and look at the thing. It's just believing your eyes. sirthomasnorth.com and keep scrolling.
You can see why Dennis was such a fun person to write about for my book. He gets so passionate about it. But yeah, just to clarify, we sort of glossed over this a little bit, but Thomas North wrote 3 main books and a 4th one as well. The Dial of Princes, which is sort of this sort of advice to princes about kind of how to live a good life. The Moral Philosophy of Doney, which is this sort of wacky book of animal fables, sort of like Aesop's fables, but it also has all these kind of moral lessons imparted in it. Plutarch's Lies, which is this biographies of these Greek and Romans, and then he sort of had this addendum called Nepos' Lives, which he sort of added a bunch more lives at the end. And what people have always known is that Shakespeare used Plutarch's Lives for the Roman plays, but what Dennis has discovered, and I think argues very convincingly, is that there are all these passages from Thomas North's other works that have come in, and it's not just the Roman plays, but it's all of Shakespeare's plays, and that's what's really truly revolutionary about what Dennis is arguing here. And his contention is that you could only do this if Thomas North was writing the plays himself, that it wasn't Shakespeare with Thomas North's works on the desk in front of him every time he sat down to write a play.
Excellent. Let's see. Pauline asks, you said plagiarism wasn't used until later, but how often was upstart crow used about writers?
That's a great question, Pauline. Hi, how are you? There are a few satirists also hit other people with that charge of being a crow at the time. So while plagiarism wasn't there and there was no copyright, and you find a poem or you find a play or whatever, you can rework it as you want. There were writers that frowned upon it and said he's getting too much credit for this work, and other people were labeled, but Shakespeare was really hit hard with this at the time.
Yeah, it was sort of a moment of transition. There were some writers like Ben Jonson and Robert Greene, who was the one who actually made the upstart crow reference, that were starting to put their names on works and really starting to own it and really start to think of it as theirs. And so, the implication was that, okay, everyone was borrowing a little bit and everyone was sort of repurposing everyone else, but Shakespeare was really doing it too much. And that's what that upstart crow reference is about.
Excellent. All right, we have a question from Lunisi, who would like to know if either of you were related to Thomas North. How did you come to Thomas North's works?
I think I probably was. I don't know. I feel it. I feel like
maybe somewhere distant.
Unfortunately, I'm not. I don't think Michael Blanding is, but we do know.
No, not that I know of.
No, I just discovered him, Dame. I didn't know who it was when I'm researching in your Seneca, and I'm looking up the lines on early English books online, the lines that Nash are quoting, the stories that Nash is quoting, the books that he's writing about. I'm just finding this name, Sir Thomas North. I didn't even know who the hell he was, and I'm like, who is this guy? And I had to, and then I had to research, and little by little.
Do you think that the digital techniques you used to start this research, like using plagiarism software, has that gained more acceptance in academia? Do you think there are other kind of literary mysteries that are going to begin to unravel with that software?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, it's controversial in some circles, particularly older professors that, are skeptical of it. But I think, you have whole departments in universities around the country that are devoted to digital scholarship now. And it's not just Shakespeare, it's, applying it to all kinds of different works and looking at the style of different writers to determine who's borrowing from who and who's influencing who. And I think it's already making some pretty amazing discoveries we couldn't have made 20 years ago. So yeah, I think it's only going to increase.
All right, and the massive databases, it's plagiarism software and the massive databases that are now available, early English books online, I keep talking about. So I couldn't have read any of these works. Dial of Princes wasn't even printed in its entirety, probably since the 17th century. So I'd have to find a library and I'd have to go there and just say, they wouldn't allow you to take such a book out. So the North Dial of Princes, but also all the works of Nash, all the works of Johnson. I couldn't have done this without being able to rapidly search through and they have them, all of the texts of the 16th century that were published in and around London.
Mike has the question, why would Shakespeare take so much from one author instead of a wide array? And it sounds like it was a unique situation that he did take so much from one author.
Well, he did. Shakespeare did also write other and adapt plays from other people. It's just that scholars have now removed those plays from the canon because they seem so un-Shakespearean. And the truth is they're just un-Northern. Shakespeare Tragedy, London Prodigal, Sir Thomas Lord Cromwell, Locrine. These are all plays that were originally attributed to Shakespeare that people believed he wrote for 100 years. And the reason that they've been removed from the canon is because they weren't originally written by North. But the reason he had so many plays from North is North was right then broke, starving in the late 1580s, early 1590s, had an entire life of plays that he had written. And the Lesterman, some of the Lesterman guy, which included William Kemp and Burbage, started working with Shakespeare, and he started selling his plays and adapting his plays and helping Shakespeare produce the plays.
Yeah, it's sort of fascinating. It really, it's another piece that puzzle piece that kind of slides into place, because Shakespeare starts writing his plays in 1589. Well, the Earl of Leicester died in 1588. And so, it creates this sort of plausible idea that maybe, when the Earl of Leicester died and Thomas North was suddenly found himself unemployed, he was on the outs with his rich brother and living penniless in London, that, he could have actually sold these plays to Shakespeare, who was the part owner in a theater company at the time. And so, again, it's sort of all these pieces kind of slide into place.
Excellent. Yeah, that was a question in the chat too. Candace asked, how could Shakespeare have access to North's journals and plays?
North's journal. How could he have access to North's journal? He didn't. He had access to North's plays. North wrote Winter's Tale and Henry VIII based on his journal and his experiences in Italy. And it was during the life of, it was during when Queen Mary was queen. And so he wrote a play that honored her, wrote plays that honored her and her mother, Catherine. So that's why he was writing them. Then Shakespeare in 1610 and then 1613 adapted them. But how he had access to his plays, there's actually a story that tells him the way he got access to all the other plays, he paid for them, and then reworked them for the public theater, and was working in the public theater. He became very, very wealthy. He became one of the wealthiest people. It's so funny that he was really the truly rich one, and Thomas North was the broke.
Right. And what's interesting about this theory too, that differentiates it from some of the other ones, is that it sort of allows for the idea that Shakespeare, could have been a brilliant playwright in his own right, and actually a brilliant adapter of plays, and maybe took these old kind of stuffy courtly plays that Thomas North wrote that were sort of, for the more, drawing room and palaces, and adapted them to the public stage, maybe put some bawdy jokes in there, maybe added some characters, cut some scenes, cut to the chase a little bit quicker. And there really may, and I think this is something that Dennis and June are still working on, trying to figure out what was Shakespeare and what was North, but it really may be the collaboration between these two brilliant minds that's created these masterpieces that we know today.
Excellent. And just a point of clarification from the chat, Candace points out that you show excerpts of North's journals side by side Shakespeare's play. My understanding is that's because North's plays are kind of lost to time. Is that right? His manuscripts, that we have clues of them from his journals somewhat.
Yeah, 80% of all plays from the era are lost, or more than that, from the era. And especially when you start going to the 1550s to the 1580s, the vast majority, well over 90% are lost. And that's because no one published plays. No one's going to publish a court play that no one's seen. They didn't even realize that people would want to read these. So there's like only a handful of plays that were ever published, and all of Lesterman's plays, and they were in operation for 29 years. Not a one survived. Not a one survived. So we know that there were old plays. We know Shakespeare used old plays. We know these old plays existed, but we just never knew who wrote them. And we have other kinds of things like the verbal fingerprints, all of the passages, North's life, to show it, and the satires, which explain that Thomas North, while broke, and that he had a falling out with his brother, actually started writing for Shakespeare.
And then we have these certain clues, like we have like the revels records where they'll say the name of the play. And sometimes you'll find a reference in a letter or something that will say what, something about the plot of the play, or like Phoenicia, you have this German version of the play that, seems like it's the same plot as Much Ado About Nothing. It has the same name as character in the source play. And so you can kind of piece these things together. And even mainstream scholars say that 1574 play Phoenicia was a source play for Much Ado About Nothing. It's just that they stop there. They don't speculate on who wrote Phoenicia or what Phoenicia actually was. And so that's what Dennis is filling in.
Right. But a lot of times they know the source play was written in the 1570s. They'll see allusions from the 1570s and they don't make the jump. Oh, that was part of the source play. And whoever wrote it was writing that. It's an E. They should. I think they're going to start accepting that very soon.
Excellent. All right.
Oh, wait. Okay, hold it. Let me get, I got to win Candace over. What is she saying? Journals, a lot of contradictions and not enough credit to where there is no apparent parallel to generally very good book. Okay, so I don't know exactly what she's saying there, but yes, we showed excerpts from his journals side by side, and I've got where you can see the journal entry and the passage, for example, in Henry VIII. You can see this on my website, which is clearly one from the other. That doesn't mean Shakespeare is the one that had Thomas North's journal and wrote that down. Thomas North is the one who did that. Then when Shakespeare adapted the play, that was left in there.
Yeah, and it's a little bit difficult at a presentation like this just to kind of get across the scope. I mean, I would recommend going to Dennis's website. It's not just Thomas North's journal, but it's all three of his translations. It's the Dial of Princes, the Moral Philosophy of Donne, Plutarch's Lives, and it's literally hundreds of passages that you can kind of see side by side. But it's hard. That's why I sort of had that scroll, so you can just see it quickly and see all that red, to kind of be able to tell the borrowings. But I think it becomes more convincing in the aggregate. And as a journalist, I never definitively say Dennis is right. I never say, he's solved the problem. But I think when you look at the amount of evidence that there's something there that's just much more than anything scholars have previously identified about Thomas North's influence on Shakespeare. And I think Dennis's theory about him writing these source plays makes a lot of sense and really deserves to be looked into. Sure. And I know and if you don't want to buy my book, you can take it out from the library in Wilmington, Andover, or Tewksbury. Yes. I know in the prologue of the book, Dennis, you clarify that you do think that Shakespeare, wrote the words attributed to him. It's just that there was some heavy borrowing, some of that, poetry and language. We can still probably give due credit to Shakespeare for. It's just, excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight, and definitely run out and get North by Shakespeare. It's a great read. Thank you. But, yes. All right. Yeah, well, thank you everyone so much for coming, and really appreciate you watching us instead of the Olympics tonight. And and I hope everyone goes out and sees Thomas North's great play, Much Ado About Nothing, aka Phoenicia, next week when it comes to the Wilmington Green. Yes, next Thursday at 7 o'clock on the Swinging Green. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.